Bollywood versus Hollywood. Heather Tyrell in this reading is helping us think through one way global culture has changed not only a local culture, a local cinematic culture in India, but also how it's changed the United States, the cultural center of cultural imperialism, or what John Tomlinson calls cultural imperialism. So, who wins, Hollywood or Bollywood? Is Bollywood an imitation of American Hollywood? This is the main question that Tyrell, the scholar who writes this piece, is wanting to ask us to think through in her chapter. Bollywood, as a term, is a fusion of the Hollywood term of, where movies are made, and also Bombay, the cultural center, and really an economic hub of India. However, it's really a representation of North Indian cinema, the parts of India where culture and cinema and arts are made are quite heterogeneous. India is not a one place, just like the United States is not a one place, but Bollywood really makes up what is known to many folks as North Indian cinema. It's really quite different than Hollywood cinema, which sort of sorts its films into genres. In the Tyrell piece, she talks about Bollywood as a cinema with a masala form, right? And in terms of masala, she is referring to sort of a recipe that has been hybridized here in the United States. She talks about Bollywood as producing movies that have many different kinds of genres. Melodrama, action, comedy, social commentary, musical dance. Where in Hollywood, those genres might produce one movie, an action movie, or a social commentary movie. But in its masala form, Tyrell argues that Bollywood is really mixing it up and defining its own cinema in the ways that, let's say, chicken tikka masala here in the United States is not necessarily a dish in India, but it has been hybridized or brought together by the cultures and the chefs that have created that dish here in the US. Tyrell argues that Bollywood could be considered what cinema studies scholars call third cinema. And third cinema, the characteristics of that sort of style of cinematic production comes from the developing world, or the third world, hence third cinema. And scholars argue that third cinema are oppositional to sort of the mainstream cultural imperialist center that produces cinema or movies and films from North America and Europe. The characteristics of a third cinema movie is that it's oppositional to those imperialist politics. It often is non-commercial, it's independent, and it also often has the minority as the subject, exploring the world from a minority perspective. So some scholars argue that Bollywood could be part of a sort of idea around third cinema because it explores the world through the lens of people who are not usually represented as the main character in a movie. However, the big argument that Tyrell puts forth is that North American, European, cultural imperialist mainstream cinema is here. Third cinema, sort of oppositional, non-commercial films are here coming from, not the imperialist center, but that Bollywood is somewhere in the middle because Bollywood has a huge international commercial market. It's also politically motivated, oftentimes offering social commentary on the political and imperialist centers of Britain or America, and that it really does critique the West in many ways, but also it is a defense against the West. that Bollywood is still maintaining its Indian authenticity and holding Indian audiences at its center when it's producing film and when it's producing ideas about India. In this piece, Tyrell argues that Hollywood has actually failed in becoming the chief or like the boss of cinema in India. In the 1990s, there was like a sort of test that she talks about with this movie called Cliffhanger. I know some of y'all are hella, young and y'all don't remember that, but it's this movie, an action movie that they dubbed and released in India, and it totally was a flop. Most Indian audiences didn't really take to it. Rather, they really embraced their Hollywood or their Bollywood cinema. I think for me, the most important takeaway from this piece is Tyrell really talking about how Hollywood became the driving force in the ideas and the ways that the whole world watches movies. She talks about how Hollywood really came about and started to rule a sort of global cinema after World War II, where other sort of countries were recovering from wars and conflicts. And when the United States political power was on top, they also were economically the top dog, and therefore could distribute sort of cultural ideas around the world globally because they were the political and economic king. And Tyrell argues that Bollywood is a challenge to that. Bollywood challenges the idea that Hollywood can come in and steamroll everybody and anybody's cultural significant production. She argues that Hollywood hasn't defined the culture in India, and actually Bollywood is showing us the way of how many local cultures really want to see themselves on screen, see themselves in their art, and that actually, quite opposite, Bollywood is coming to take over American ideas, American imaginations, and American